Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the Upanishads, the classical literature of Indian spiritual tradition. With me is Professor Debashish Banerji. He is the Haridas Chaudhuri Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures, and he is the chairman of the Department of East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. He is also author of a book of commentaries on the Isha Upanishads, which is now in press. He is also author of Seven Quartets of Becoming, which is his interpretation of the yoga psychology of Sri Aurobindo, and he is the editor of a recently published anthology called Critical Posthumanism and Planetary Futures. Welcome again, Debashish.
Thank you, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you and to talk about, I think what every scholar of religion would agree is one of the great religious classics, the Upanishads.
Indeed. Thank you. Pleasure talking to you about it.
Mm-hmm. So the Upanishads come after the Vedas. We have had an earlier conversation about the Rig Veda.
Right.
I guess there was probably a transitional period before the Upanishads. There was also the Brahmanas.
Yes, indeed. So we were talking about the Rig Veda as already a sort of set of verses that span some time, mm-hmm. and that there is some difference between early and later Vedic literature or Rig Vedic literature. So the 10th mandala shows us some new features. Mm-hmm. And according to modern dating, they'd say this is happening around 1200 BC or so. And other Vedic texts are also being written around that time, texts known as the Brahmanas, mm-hmm. and also as the Aranyakas. The Brahmanas are interpreting the verses of the Rig Veda to some extent, introducing some of the mythology and also showing some of the ritual uses of these verses. Mm-hmm. And the Aranyakas are supposed to be kind of proto-wisdom texts that are mining some of the wisdom of the Veda. Mm-hmm. And what we call the Upanishads initially begin as portions of these Brahmanas and Aranyakas. Mm-hmm. So the earliest Upanishads are the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and the Chandogya Upanishad. And these are sprawling compilations of material that are coming out of Brahmanas. And that's the reason why the Brihadaranyaka is called Brihadaranyaka. Aranyaka is that class of forest texts. Mm-hmm. And Brihad means vast. So in a sense, you could translate it as the vast forest Upanishad.
Okay.
And the other one called the Chandogya Upanishad is Chanda is a rhythm. Mm-hmm. And it's connected to the Sama Veda, which is another one of the four major Vedas related to chanting and singing. Mm-hmm. So Chandogya Upanishad is considered to be it's somehow related to chanting and things like that.
Well, chanting and singing along with meditation and right. yoga and right. pranayama are all the practices that were already well developed in ancient India at that time.
Indeed. So initially, as we are discussing, say about 1200 to going up to the 8th century BC or so, there are these, the additions to the commentaries on the mm-hmm. Rig Veda that are, in some sense, becoming a new kind of literature. Mm-hmm. They're introducing new concepts. Mm-hmm. They're introducing ideas of new practices. And they evidence a kind of relationship with the Veda, which is not exactly in line, to some extent critical of the Veda. And we can surmise from that there is a social change going on as well. So that after these two Upanishads, the later Upanishads, develop a kind of form and a literary character of their own and become a class of literature called the Upanishads.
Well, I gather that there are different social groups that are now contributing to this body of spiritual texts. You have the ascetics who are out in the forest, which is a very ancient tradition. You have the urban cultures. And the very name Brahmanas, to me, and I may be quite naive about this, but it suggests to me the priestly class of the Brahmins.
Quite absolutely. You're quite right. Absolutely right, Jeff. And so, as I see it, what is happening around this period is that the kind of scheme or cosmology of the Veda that we discussed, which is really a heliocentric cosmology, which has the sun at the center and orbits of planets around the sun, is getting translated into the social sphere. So we are developing a kind of a symbolic society that has the model of the Veda as its organizing metaphor. And what we find is that this privileges certain types of classes. In the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda, we talked about the caste system. The properties of the sun are now divided into the castes. And the caste system as a organizing metaphor for society, along with that of a royal class and a priestly class that to some extent become the, rulers of that society, eventually leads to a fossilization of society. And there's a collusion, which is common to many historical societies, early societies, between the priestly class and the aristocrats, the royalty, that keep the rest under subjugation. And it becomes impossible for the individual to have direct access to truth. They have to go through the priests who will do rituals. And I believe what is happening at this time is that a number of adepts are moving out of the polis, of the city circles, and going to the periphery, forming what we today know as ashramas there, hermitages or secluded initiate communities. And they're also coming into contact with these forest communities that you just talked about, so that they incorporate new practices and they create a new language that in some sense is restating the secrets or the esoteric truths of the Veda in a way that individuals can practice it in an unmediated fashion. They don't need the mediation of the priest. So this is really the big shift that's taking place with the Upanishads, as I see it.
And I gather they're also more philosophical in their orientation, more sophisticated in terms of the various categories of understanding than the Vedas.
Yeah, and as we discussed last time, it's a kind of a mythic, it's a transition from the mythic to the more philosophical. And that particular transition also brings a new language, because in that kind of language, you don't have the coded metaphors that need to be kept private among Brahmins, but can be understood by the intelligence directly. So I think that's the reason why they're looking for a new language. But they also create new concepts. New concepts are created which are more adequate to this new type of practice and transmission.
Now, it's fair to say that the Upanishads, the Brahmanas, and the Vedas are all written in Sanskrit, aren't they?
Yes, it's all Sanskrit. The Veda is a early Sanskrit that is called Vedic Sanskrit. So Sanskrit has not yet become grammatized as it is later. Upanishads are closer to a more grammatical Sanskrit, but it's in transition.
So, I mean, even in looking at the development of grammar, you can see that culture itself is evolving here.
Exactly. Culture is definitely evolving. Yes.
But philosophically speaking, we talked about the Vedas expressing two different worlds, the solar world of unity and the earthly world of day and night and polarity and duality. How do the Upanishads treat these two worlds?
So the Upanishads carry these ideas forward and give them new terms. And we'll find that these two realms also become more divided and given more fine-tuning, greater resolution in the Upanishads. But these two worlds are about the middle Upanishads, they're going to use the term vidya and avidya for these realms.
Vidya meaning wisdom.
Vidya literally means knowledge.
Knowledge. In fact, it's used as a word for science, is it not?
Quite, you're right. So, so knowledge and ignorance become the two words. And it's interesting to see why they look at it as knowledge and ignorance, when really the realm of dualities is what we understand as the realm where we have to find knowledge.
Yes.
So for them, for the Upanishadic thinkers, the undivided realm is the realm of knowledge, because there everything is known by being. There is one being, and if it's differentiated, it's not divided. It's differentiated but not divided. So even in terms of the positions that it may take to itself, it knows its own others as parts of itself.
Is this where the concept of Maya is introduced?
Exactly. Now, the really interesting thing, Jeff, is that in the Upanishads, the word Maya appears only rather late and very few times, only once in a major Upanishad, in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, which is a relatively late Upanishad. And even there, it doesn't really explain it in terms that we know today through Shankara's use of Maya. But indeed, I think the way in which Maya is being used over there does point to this dividing, the line dividing these two realms. The ignorant realm, the realm of dualities, is called so because whatever knowledge we can derive there is inferred knowledge. We live in a world that's already fragmented. And each individual entity looks upon the world with itself at the center, and it infers everything that it knows about the world. So it's a kind of ignorance. It's not really, it's direct knowledge.
It sort of reminds me of Freud's notion of our defense mechanisms. We see the world through all of our psychological mechanisms that we project out onto the world.
Quite true.
And that's kind of a delusion.
It's a delusion. Also, we can think about it as a Kantian notion of the knowledge of things through the use of faculties that we share in common, the mental faculties, but which gives us only a interpreted scheme for reality, but not reality as it itself is.
Now, Kant is a very difficult philosopher for many people, but I gather that what Kant is saying is that the concepts of space and time through which we see everything in terms of space and time are imposed by our own nervous system.
Right. They're transcendentally given. And then what we do is we create our understanding on that basis, with that as the canvas. So the early
Hindu or Vedic thinkers who introduced the concept of Maya may be sort of hinting at that.
Yeah, they're definitely hinting at that there is a kind of a realm of knowledge which is undivided and where things are known directly, and a realm of knowledge which is that which we have, in which we know things only relatively, not directly.
And I suppose it's the case that today, for example, many materialistic thinkers would view the situation as reverse, that we know the world of duality directly, and this world of unity is something we only surmise.
True. And that is also true. I think with the Buddha, he inverts a lot of the categories of the Upanishads, bringing it closer to our ordinary experience, and then showing us a way out of that. But it's just a perspective, a inversion of perspective. But I think these people are looking at it from a transcendental lens. And so for them, the undivided consciousness is the primary one, and the divided consciousness is what we experience as a result.
But Buddhism itself grew out of this Upanishadic culture.
Indeed.
As basically as a critical reaction to it.
Absolutely. That's what happens, not even as a critical reaction. I'd say Buddhism appearing around the 5th century BC represents another shift where the communities that have gone to the periphery are returning to the city. And now they're returning in a way in which they need to address the common person who can't understand these transcendental categories. So the Buddha devised a way by which he could approach people according to the experience that they were having, which is an experience of suffering, an experience of phenomena, a phenomenal experience, not what would be called a noumenal experience.
Well, it's not so different today, really. If I happen to do an interview where we say, reality is all blissful.
Right.
and we're all unified. All is one. Reality is blissful. I'll hear from a lot of viewers who will say, no, that's not my experience.
Exactly. So I think over time, there's an interesting modern philosopher, Michel de Certeau, and he has proposed a new discipline called mystics, by which he means not mystics as a noun, but mystics as a discipline. In other words, how do we study the conditions of mystical experience? And he's saying that we have to ground it in the social conditions. And we'll see that concepts arise which are based on the social conditions in which experiences occur. So if we look at the Upanishads as a kind of a movement to the periphery, we find that there is a need to differentiate oneself from the mass, from the conditioning of the Veda. And the idea of self, for example, is really important to create as a concept, because that doesn't exist in the mythical scheme of the Veda. So we find that the really, I think, important invention from the earliest Upanishads is that of Atman. See? So Brahman and Atman. Brahman, you could say, is the undivided realm, but Atman is its individualization in entities in the dualistic realm. And if this concept, if we ground it in the fact that there is need for wriggle room in a society that is conditioned, we can see how important it becomes. Well,
the great equation, I'll call it an equation, that comes out of the Upanishads, I believe, is this idea that Atman, my deepest inner self, is equal to Brahman, which, am I pronouncing that correctly?
That's right, Brahman,
I had a kind of hard CH, Brahman? And which is the essence, the inner consciousness of the whole universe.
Right.
That seems to me to be the epitome of mysticism.
Exactly. It gives us individual unmediated access. It tells us we are the whole. So I think that was a great revolution. By the time we come to the Buddha and he goes back to the polis, he has to address a new kind of people. And he's telling them now, don't get confused. Don't confuse your phenomenal existence with Atman. Atman is your physical experience is not the Atman because it's transient. Your emotions are not the Atman. That's transient. Your thoughts are not the Atman. Your prior conditioning, samskaras, are not the Atman. So essentially, he is, describing what he calls the skandhas, which are the 5 constituents of phenomenal existence.
Yes.
And saying, don't identify the Atman with those constituents of phenomenal existence. The Atman is outside, or he doesn't want to pass any judgment on the Atman. But it's really what's called an apophatic teaching, which means a negative identification. You are not this, not this, not this. But what you are is not told to you because you are the residue or remainder. You see? And this kind of method is an Upanishadic method. In the very earliest Upanishads, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, they're introducing you to this method. It's called neti. In other words,
neti, yes.
Yeah. It's a very interesting, famous dialogue between the teacher, Yagyavvalkya, and one of his 2 wives. And he's about to leave his home. And he wants to divide his belongings among his wives. And one of them accepts what he's giving. And the other one questions him and says, but why are you giving me these material things? You must be getting something which is more valuable than that. Why don't you tell me about that? And that's where the dialogue begins. And finally she asks him, but how am I to obtain that which you're talking about, the Atman? And the answers he gives are very interesting because they constitute some of the earliest philosophical approaches to what we call yoga, the union of the Atman and Brahman.
It sounds very reminiscent of Plato.
Right. Interesting.
I mean, Plato also focuses, according to our friend Pierre Grimes, on the self.
Right. So this is the discovery of the innermost self as nothing other than the totality that has become individualized and bridging the heliocentric and the geocentric.
Pierre, our friend Pierre Grimes, who I've interviewed many times, suggests that the self and what Plato calls the one are identical. Right.
And so it moves into Greek. I mean, we find it in Greek philosophy as well. That's
the same evolution.
Same evolution, yeah.
There's a sense in which this thinking, certainly according to Pierre, and I'm inclined to agree with him, is sort of the pinnacle of spiritual philosophy.
Right, and indeed, there's some interesting shifts there as well. But I wanted to mention the kind of answers he gives. One of them is this apophatic answer. He says you arrive at it through non-identification. Neti. Whatever you think you are, you say, I am not this. And you go into something deeper.
Not that
either. And the residue is going to be that. So that's the apophatic method. But he simultaneously gives what is today called a cataphatic method.
Now we're talking about the Buddha.
No, we're talking about Yagyavvalkya in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad.
Oh, okay.
Which is really earlier predecessor. So I'd say the Buddhist teachings are really emerging out of these kinds of teachings.
In other words, what you're saying is that Buddhism could be viewed as a branch of the Upanishads.
Sure, it could be viewed as an extension
of a lot the Upanishadic
under
thinking.
New social conditions. Of Upanishadic teaching.
So there's a very thin line between Buddhism and classical Vedic thought.
Yeah, I would say so.
Much like, some people compare it to Christianity and Judaism.
Indeed, very possible. The cataphatic method is going to take symbols, and this Yajnavalkya will throw out a number of symbols as formulae for contemplation. He'll say, like a streak of lightning, like the lotus, like a number of these kinds of symbols, and so they become handles for contemplation. Yeah. And then the third really important method he gives is focusing the thought, focusing the cognition in a one-pointed manner on things seen and heard, with the idea that they are forms of the Brahman. So he says it becomes a formula that carries through to our times, even in modern schools of music or art in India. They repeat this formula. It says Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. And he uses actually 4 terms: Shravana, Darshana, Manana, Nididhyasana. The Shravana is to hear. Darshana is to see. Manana is to focus the thought. And Nididhyasana is to arrive at identity. So essentially, it's giving us a method by saying that whatever you see, tune the thought on it to think that this is the Brahman. What you're looking at is not something separate, but it is the one being. What you're hearing is the mantra, for example, is just a sound body of the one being. And if you can keep your mind on that, then you arrive at a state of identity. So these are forms of yoga that later will become really ubiquitous in Indian practice.
Now, you mentioned the term mantra.
Yes.
And when I think of mantra, I think most people right away, they come up with the mantra Om. That seems to be the most universal of all the mantras. Does that come out of the Upanishads?
The mantra Om is a legacy of the Upanishads, right? And there's an entire Upanishad around the mantra Om. But I'd like to also mention that I think the Veda is also considered mantra, but that mantra is a mantra. By the time of the Upanishads, it's become a mantra of rote repetition. So one of these really early Upanishads, this Chandogya Upanishad, which I consider a countercultural Upanishad, has a parable called the parable of the dogs. And essentially, it's poking fun at the repetition of mantras in the Veda. So it says that a dog was watching this great sage teach. So he goes to the great sage and says, "Teach me, O master." And the great sage says, "Okay, come back tomorrow." So they say that the text says that the dog comes back with the entire pack. And they're coming in a straight line, holding each other's tails in the mouth of the next dog. So it's a line of dogs holding on to each other out of fear of being separated. And they come to the teacher, but they don't really understand what the teacher says. So they keep looking at the moon and baying and saying, "Om, give us food. Om, give us shelter," etc. So it's really a parody about people who take these teachings and repeat them without understanding what they mean and making them into materialistic, sort of demands. While then later they're going to talk about the Om. And the Om becomes not only something that one repeats, but one focuses the mind on. So the entire Upanishad, called the Mandukya Upanishad, is about the 4 stations of the Om. That's the Upanishad that talks about the waking, dreaming, sleepless, dreamless sleep, and the 4th condition of existence, which is a really famous Upanishad.
The conditions of consciousness.
the conditions of consciousness, but it relates them to the syllables of the Om.
I see. So you have a sense now that the writers of the Upanishads, who are sort of philosophical but still also poetical and mythical, are some of the earliest psychologists.
Indeed. I think it's psychological, it's philosophical, and it's poetic. And I think that kind of utterance, proto-philosophical utterance, which is poetry, philosophy, and psychology together, is similar to pre-Socratic Greek literature like that by Heraclitus or those kinds of thinkers. And it's an interesting kind of literature to go back to when we talk about a kind of a post-cognitive philosophy, which is often being spoken of today as a need for our times.
People say these days we're too caught up in our intellect.
Right.
That we've lost touch with the mythic power.
Exactly. The mythic power, the poetic power, the earthly power. So how can we be more intimate to our environment rather than separated from it in our thinking? So how can the thought be fused with the feelings and with the deeper perceptions, intuitions?
We often have a tendency to project upon ancient peoples a worldview that's similar to our own.
Right.
But chances are that their worldview was very, very different.
Yes, indeed. I quite agree, Jeff. Yeah.
I suppose even hard for us to articulate when you read these words in Sanskrit and translate them according to modern translation. Does that awaken something in you?
Indeed. I think translation is a really important thing. So how one translates these things gives us access to them. And I think it's important to translate them in ways that bring these practices alive. We talked about the difference between vidya and avidya, for example, or the heliocentric and the geocentric. And the Upanishads are going to talk about the bridging of the two, not the transcendence into one while leaving the other behind, you see. And immediately we realize that such a kind of an idea can't be talked about in a clear, logical fashion. You have to talk about it paradoxically. So Upanishads include a lot of paradoxical ideas, and these become forms of meditation. For example, the Isha Upanishad that you spoke about, that I'm writing on.
Yes.
It has these paradoxical lines. I mean, if we translate them, they go something like this. The one unmoving is swifter than thought. It moves and it moves not. It is very close to us, yet it is very far. So this kind of a sentence, which is couched completely in paradox, I consider these types of sentences to be the origin of the Japanese koan at a later point of time, because there is no real answer to the koan. There are puzzles and paradoxes that you have to put your attention on. And at a certain point, you go beyond the mind's understanding and have the experience of it. It's talking about another dimension, which is a dimension that exceeds our, sort of dimension of geocentric limitation.
Well, this brings to mind the word dhyana.
Yes.
For me, which is, I think, the Sanskrit root word for our word knowledge, is it not?
Absolutely, yes. Dhyana is not only knowledge, it's also the focusing of the concentration. It's concentration.
Concentration. Yeah. And I understand that in China, the word dhyana became translated as Chan.
Yes.
And then in Japan, Zen.
Exactly.
So the Zen Buddhist koan comes out of the Sanskrit concept of dhyana.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So dhyana is one of the primary methods of the Upanishads, which is how do we use our mind to focus it on ideas or concepts that will change our reality. You see, catapult us into another dimension of existence.
And it's very different than Aristotelian logic.
Yes, exactly. Which is rational.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's using what might, at least from an Aristotelian point of view, seem completely irrational as a way to propel the mind to another level.
Indeed. And I think in our times today, we are grappling with thoughts like that, because I think we've come to the limit condition of mental separatism. The mind has separated itself, alienated itself from the world to an extent where we realize that we have to contemplate paradox to return to reality. And, you have philosophers like Jacques Derrida, who's talking about deconstruction.
Yes.
But his entire philosophy of deconstruction is also based on what he calls aporia. Aporia is a Greek word that stands for a dead end, a mental dead end at a paradox. You come to a point where you can't go any further because you've encountered the opposition of your own thought, and that's as strong as your own idea.
And when you translate that into culture, it seems to me that one could say all of our modern science and technology is leading humanity closer and closer to self-destruction, which is an absurdity.
Exactly.
And maybe the way out is to begin to contemplate the nature of absurdity.
Exactly. And this is how you do it. I mean, once you really recognize it, Sri Aurobindo has an interesting aphorism where he's talking about his own experience. He says, the day I realized that every thought of mine, for every thought of mine, the opposite was equally true, the prestige of the mind fell off. And I could contemplate reality. You see, so this is also what Derrida is talking about. He says that there are hidden choices in our premises, in our propositions, that we've actually privileged a certain idea over its opposite. And if we really look at it and allow the opposite to emerge, it's in the text itself as the shadow of what is being proposed. And then we contemplate the two together. That is indeed what is deconstruction.
And I think if I understand postmodern deconstruction, one of the points they're making is there is no privileged perspective.
Right.
All perspectives are valid.
Right. So to preserve plurality, to preserve these various views from being swallowed up one by another, which is in a political sense a form of fascism, is to arrive at a point where we can endure reality as it is. And I think behind that, choice is practical. We can take choices, but we have to understand a dimension that is below our privileging of one idea over the other.
Now, of course, we're talking about contemporary philosophy with Jacques Derrida. However, a lot of this is anticipated as early as the Upanishads.
Exactly. I think that's really the interesting point about the way in which the Upanishads employs devices, literary devices, to take us beyond our present entrapment, let's say, in logocentric thinking.
We say that logocentric?
Logocentric, another way of saying rational. In other words, logical and a kind of a thought that is centered in, in this ideological privileging of certain propositions.
Well, if I understand logic correctly, and I'm no expert in logic, but it seems to me every logical system has to start out with a priori assumptions.
Right.
And those a priori assumptions, sometimes I think they're called primitives, they become privileged.
Right. Exactly.
And that's the trap right there with all logic.
Right. So going back to this Isha Upanishad, for example, again, they very, it's a very succinct Upanishad. It's got 18 couplets. And it's a poetic Upanishad. In other words, we find that Upanishads are also evolving from the early, very sprawling prose Upanishads, Brihadaranyaka and Chandogya Upanishads, to really crystallic condensations of poetic thought by the time of the Isha Upanishad. And we find that they kind of juxtapose ideas in a literary way that forces your contemplation. So they'll look at these two realms, the Vidya and the Avidya, or the heliocentric and the geocentric, in a series of couplets. And it'll say, those who enter the Avidya, enter into a darkness.
And avidya meaning ignorance.
Ignorance.
Yes.
But those who enter into Vidya alone, exclusively, enter into an even greater darkness. And then they'll say that from the Vidya, we get a certain result. From the Avidya, we get another result. So we have to know the two as one.
They're complementary.
They're complementary. And in a way, we have to find a certain station of existence where the two are seen as non-dual. I mean, from where do they emerge? We have to find a third. This is almost like a dialectical position. And then towards the end of that particular Upanishad, it's going to be talk about the veil. So they don't use the word Maya, but they give a poetic representation. And they say, there is a golden lid that separates the sun from its rays, in between the infinite scattering of light and the sun, there is a golden lid that says that remove from our eyes, O fosterer. It uses one of the Vedic names for the sun god, Pushan. O Pushan, remove that by your grace from our eyes, so that we may behold both the sun and its rays together. The whole, the totality, the integrality, not the duality.
The sun and its rays sort of seems reminiscent of the idea of universal consciousness and all of the individual entities that are the composites of the universal consciousness.
Exactly. And that which is its source or foundation, neither separated from the other.
Well, Debashish, once again, a very enlightening conversation about a very important literary heritage of all humanity. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with me today.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us.